hands. If you can provide a couple of goals here and there and make quick plays, if you're in a bottom six role, nothing wrong with that at all. But hey, I say we bring the expert in and get Cam on the show here.
Yeah, no problem.
To fill us up with some knowledge.
We need to get the actual expert who spent a lot of time reviewing these prospects on, just like we had Steve. So we'll cue up the interview with Cam right now. All right, so we can just get right into it because I know you're short on time. You're at the airport, you're heading home. So we'll start off with just an overall look at the Ducks draft. We'll get into some of the players, of course, after. But how do you think they did? I know a lot of people put out grades, and I guess a lot of them do fall on bias. I've seen C- just thrown around. I've seen some Bs. I think I recently saw Steve Cornianos give the Ducks an A-. How do you think they did at the draft?
Ranking a draft class the moment it's done is so challenging, right? Because realistically, we don't know what this is going to look like for 5-10 years.
Yeah.
So I like what the Ducks did. So they got Lundestrom there at 23, and I think that's good value for him. I think he could have gone anywhere from kind of 14 to about 23. So especially you saw teams reaching on centers early and often there. So I think they did very well to grab him there in the first. And they got themselves another center in the second round with Gould. So Gould's a speedy kid who former first overall pick in the QMJHL draft. Hasn't really lived up to the expectations yet, but he's a gamer and he's got some skills, and I think that was a nice spot there. Whatever they got him at 55 or 54. And overall too, I like Blake McLaughlin. I think he's got some skills. Playing in the USHL. Another guy who's got really nice speed. Plays on the left side. I like Lucas Dostal. He might be, the second best goalie in this crop for my money. I don't remember exactly where I had him on my board, but in that 85 range is perfect, I think. And then when you're swinging in 4, 5, 6, they're just lottery tickets at that point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the focus a lot of people was definitely on the first four guys, and we'll start off with Isac Lundestrom, and I think this was an important draft for the Ducks to finally bring in some centers. You've got Sam Steele, who's kind of the corner piece right now. Maybe not an elite guy. I think he's kind of right just outside that tier, but that's the go-to guy. And then you saw them draft some guys who could play center. I think Maxime Comtois played that before. Antoine Morand is maybe a guy who could play at center in the National Hockey League. He still could be a guy that might project as a winger. And I think the same goes for Troy Terry. But you see them take a guy in Lundestrom who should be a center when he gets there. I think the only question marks about him are how high his ceiling is offensively.
Yeah, that's right. So I definitely see him as a pivot moving forward, and he's played that in the SHL for most of this season and a little bit even as a draft -1 player last year in the Swedish Hockey League. So that's a great sign for him. He's pretty good on faceoffs. He's defensively responsible. He's got a projectable frame. You're absolutely right questioning the top end offensive ceiling of him. I definitely don't see him as a top line center. I think if everything breaks right, he could be a nice guy on a second line. Probably more realistically, he becomes a third-line center or that mid-six center that can kind of move up and down, maybe play on a second power play unit, kill some penalties for you. He's kind of a jack-of-all-trades. He's an all-around type of player who I really like. I wanted to see him take a few more steps offensively this year, which hasn't happened, but that's not the end of the world, especially at 23. If you can get yourself an NHL player that can play in your middle six down the middle, too, that's going to be a good grab for the team.
Yeah, I think, too, the one thing I think about him is, of course, like you said, the two-way game is there, and the offense is what a lot of people have an issue around. But I think he's a guy, maybe if you give him a little bit of more role where he can thrive in offensively. I know when he got thrown into the fire when Elias Anderson was out in the World Juniors, he kind of thrived in that role, and we saw a little bit more of his offensive exploits. And maybe we'll see that a bit more in the SHL coming up this next season, that if he's given that opportunity a bit more, then maybe we'll see that, because you see it in spurts at times. There are games where he takes over and he looks like he's got that offensive side to his game, and then there are games where he kind of disappears, and maybe not disappears in a bad way where he's really focusing on the defensive side of the game. But I think if he's given that more of a role to expand, that we'll really see him thrive offensively.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so I made that comment back in January too, that you see when you give him an opportunity up the lineup and play with creative players and put in offensive situations that he does have, he has a higher ceiling than some were giving him credit for, than projecting him as a bottom six center. I think he does have the ability to step up his game a little bit. He's not the fastest player, so that might hold him back a little bit on the small ice to create offense. But down low, he's hard to handle. He protects the puck well. He does have some nice hands. So, yeah, I really like the pick, and I think he could be a guy that, down the line can chip in 40, maybe 50 points for you at some point.
Yeah, and we don't really see a guy that often. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, where he has so much pro experience going into his draft year, especially in Sweden. I think he played about 91 games, is it now, over the last 2 seasons in the top league in Sweden. I mean, that has to project to him maybe getting to the NHL sooner rather than later. How quick do you think it is before he's either in the NHL or at least in the AHL with San Diego?
Yeah, he's quite polished as a player. So defensively, obviously, as we already talked about, that he's very reliable, and that's going to be a translatable skill that coaches are going to love. So I don't really expect him to cross over this season. I don't know if the Ducks have plans to bring him over for training camp or just let him start his year early in the NHL like most of the kids do. See his role expand, maybe put up a few more points, get comfortable, and then you could see him crossing over and potentially sliding into like a fourth-line center role for the team in 2019-20, or have him play some bigger minutes in the AHL and get acclimatized to the smaller ice and the different style of play in North America. So, you could see him anywhere from 1 to 3 years away from being on the NHL team. It's kind of all up to him, but his traits are going to be something that translates to the NHL ice sooner than some of these other kids that are playing junior hockey.
Yeah, and I think there was one criticism a lot of people had with the draft. I think people liked the pick and bringing in a center into the organization, but the Ducks tend to play it safe a lot with their picks, more of a guy who has a projectable floor, and then the ceiling, there's a little bit of a question about that. Do you think there was a guy that maybe they could have taken a swing on instead of Lundestrom at 23 that maybe has a higher ceiling, but there's a little bit more risk involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Dominic Bach was sitting there at 23, which I was pretty upset that he was still there. Then he was sitting there at 24 and then at 25, and finally St. Louis jumped up and grabbed him. So Dominic Bach would be that guy for me. I really like Bach. Anaheim does have some nice young they have some nice young defensemen on their team, so they were able to pass on guys like Bodan and Lundqvist. But to get a really highly skilled player, Bach does carry a little more risk. He only played a handful of games in the SHL this past season, but he can just stick handle on a phone booth sort of thing. So he's a player that they could have taken a big swing on.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, again, you're not getting a bad player at 23, and if Lundestrom comes in, he's a third-line center. I mean, that's you can't always get a Rickard Rakell or a Sam Steele in the late first round, a guy who's going to come in and be an elite offensive player. It's not going to happen, and I think if you do get, you play it safe and you end up getting the second-line, third-line center, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I guess we move on to the second pick here in Bo Gruel, and it's almost the same type of pick, kind of a safe floor over a risky ceiling type pick where he's kind of a jack of all trades again, where he's good at a lot of things, but he's not really elite at one skill set.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. So a guy that was picked by many to be a first-round talent, especially like I said, he was drafted early in the Hugh draft and projected to be, maybe even in the first half of the first round. And I think he was at the tail end of my first round last August when I first put up a ranking, and just kind of consistently slid back into that mid-late second round. But again, like you said, he's a pretty safe player. He has some pro skills that you can see. He's willing to engage. He has good speed. He's pretty strong defensively. Just that offensive ceiling doesn't look like it's there at this point. So another guy that you hope you can slide into your middle six and contribute on a PK sort of thing. But I don't project him to be a first power play guy or a real top six forward.
And do you think he fell more because there wasn't just an elite skill set that he showed he had, or was it because other guys around him they were doing a lot better and moved in front of him?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. So when a player, I don't want to say he stagnated, but he maybe didn't take these steps expected of him. And then other players did, right? So it's kind of a little bit of both there.
And the ISS ranked him as the top defensive forward in the class. Do you think that's, you mentioned putting him on the PK, slide him into your bottom six. That's what you kind of expect as a guy who has that type of acumen in defensively. Do you think that is a fair assessment of him and the other guys in this draft?
That he's the top defensive player in this draft?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I could go that far without giving it a great deal of thought. But he definitely plays his position well. He gets in front of shots. He has a good stick. He gets in on the forecheck very well. So he is very, very effective on the penalty kill, which is something you want to see, especially from an energy player like I project him to be. So we'll see if he stays in the middle of the ice too. So he has played a little bit of wing, and when he moves up, he might end up being that kind of checking line winger for you as well. But either way, in the tail end of the second round, you're trying to get NHLers, and I think he's got a good chance of being one.
Yeah, and the last thing I have for Grew is there's a little bit of a worry that playing with Zadina, can he do it on his own? And we see this all the time. I mean, Dylan Strome, when he was in Erie with Connor McDavid, can Dylan Strome do it on his own? It's the same thing here, I feel like, with Grew playing on the same line with Zadina. Do you think playing with such an elite talent had any influence on his production, or do you think he is really a guy who can hold his own?
No, definitely playing with an all-world talent like Zadina inflated his stats, and I don't think there was really much confusion by many people about that. So if you're playing on a team that he was the anchor on the line, he was driving play and creating and ended up with those point totals, he would have got selected much higher. So it's nice to see that he can play with skilled players. You want to see that their game can be elevated with quality talent, because as he moves up, he's going to be playing with better players. And if injuries arise and he gets an opportunity to slide up the lineup, he can show that he can play with skilled players. So that's a positive sign, but at the same time, it needs to be expected that he's not going to be a high-end offensive player, as his numbers may indicate in a different situation.
For sure. And moving on to the next guy here in Blake McLaughlin, I think this was maybe a pick where maybe the Ducks didn't really take necessarily a risk, but they might have got a steal at this point, because there were a lot of people who had tagged him as maybe a first-round or second-round talent, and he falls to the Ducks in the third round. And I think he's a guy a lot of people haven't seen playing out with Chicago in the USHL. What's kind of the profile on a guy like Blake McLaughlin?
Kid's got a lot of speed, and he uses it well. He gets in on the forecheck. He can cause a little havoc, create some turnovers. He's got pretty good hands. And you're absolutely right. I really like him in that range there at the tail end of the third round. There was a string of picks late in the third round that I really, really liked, that I felt a great deal of those players had an opportunity to go early. And Anaheim got in on it with McLaughlin.
Yeah, and there was I really didn't see the only thing I saw that maybe said he fell was some off-ice issues. I haven't been able to find anything on that. Was there a reason that he fell out? Because, like I said, there was a lot of people who thought maybe not first round, but at least high second round talent, and he falls all the way down to the third round.
Yeah, unfortunately for me, I just trust what I see. I don't get to be in the room and get a real judge on these guys' character and things like that, so I can't comment on that. But there's like I said, in that tail end of the third round, even all the way through the third round, there's a lot of good players that I had in my second round, and they kind of all slipped down. And it's just kind of this draft in particular, it was a real blender, and teams took swings on players that many of us thought would be going far later, and they jumped up and grabbed them early, and thus pushed these other guys back down the list.
Yeah, and I think he complements a little bit what the Ducks were looking to do, bringing in two maybe defensive-focused centers with the first two picks, and then bringing a guy who maybe has not game-breaking talent, but at least can provide a little bit of something like that. I know like you said, you missed on Bach in the first round, and then you bring in a guy who at least has some playmaking ability and some skill with this third-round pick.
Yeah, definitely. I think he. I don't want to say as the highest offensive upside of the three, because I think that'd be discounting Lundestrom a little bit. But for where he's picked, I think it's really nice value.
Yeah, and we'll move on to the last guy we'll talk about here in the end of the third round was Lukas Dostal, and he was a guy that was ranked number one for European goaltenders in this draft, and we saw, I think, 3 European goaltenders go in front of him. And I know goaltending, it's always hard to project, and some teams will like one guy over another guy based on different things. What do you think from Lukas Dostal? I mean, we saw a bit of him at the World Junior Championship, I believe. Is he a guy that teams should look out for? Is he a guy that projects maybe as a backup or a starter in the National Hockey
League? Well, it's hard to know at this point. Yeah. He's quite raw. So I think he's only about 6'1", maybe slight 165 pounds, if I'm remembering correctly. I played in the Tier 2 league over there in the Czech, and very, very quick, has great reflexes, I don't consider myself an expert on scouting goaltenders, but I did like what I saw from him when I did see him. And speaking with some of the guys that I do trust and rely on, they like him as well. And so for the most